All right, now that we've talked about the players, sorted out their stats and all of that, let's get down to the simulation. So before we actually play this mock regular 2020 season, we have to address all of the practicality measures just to make sure that this simulation is as realistic as possible. So here's my favorite part. Let's first talk about the stadiums. In terms of the current college football stadiums, some range from huge to small. The smallest in the FBS is Jerry Richardson Stadium used by UNC Charlotte that seats 15,134 people. Now, we are not including Clarence T.C. Ching Field at the University of Hawaii, which is about 6,000 to 9,000 people. I do not count that as not the home stadium of UH. The new Aloha Stadium likely is going to be much bigger than that, so we're not counting that. But stadium sizes vary by the size of the school. Some FBS programs don't have many students. Say, you got Texas, who has 51,832 students. Texas A&M, 69,465. UCF, 68,571 kids go there. So, therefore, the stadiums have to be a little bit bigger. Yada, 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 yada. You got a school like Tulsa, obviously not going to have as big of a stadium as Texas. But yes, stadiums would be the biggest part of this whole deal, and it would be hard to finance some of these. I do agree. But a lot of schools already have some fields nearby that they can play at and maybe even retrofit to be D1 ready. So first, let's talk about the stadiums on campuses that don't have a stadium. First, we'll go to UC San Diego. Now, if you've ever been to La Jolla, which for the record is not a city that is not only incredibly limited in space due to its location on a cliff, but also due to the fact that it's one of the most expensive places to live in the entire United States. Not to mention the campus at UCSD is pretty land-challenged, for lack of a better term. And yes, there's Triton Soccer Field, which was newly renovated, but that's not even a 20th the size of a proper FBS stadium. Therefore, much like San Diego State or UCLA, UC San Diego will not play on campus. They'll have to play at an off-campus site with history for days. San Diego's first football stadium was Balboa Stadium, which was built for the 1915 Panama, California Exposition, and originally had a capacity of over 15,000. You know about Balboa Park, you know about this whole history. The stadium then expanded for the upstart San Diego Chargers in 1961, housed them for 5 years until Qualcomm Stadium, or SDCCU Stadium, was built. Now, my theory, since San Diego State was created long before UCSD was, SDSU would make Balboa Stadium their home for college football. In fact, they did play their home games there until 1935, until they played on the on-campus Aztec Bowl, until Qualcomm was eventually made, Jack Murphy at the time, San Diego Stadium, and they permanently moved there. But let's just say, hypothetically, they stayed at Balboa. Now, the stadium would not be torn down. It would be made into a smaller venue just for high school. That's what is currently today's stadium. It's not even a third as big as what it used to be. Also, Snapdragon Stadium, which is another Qualcomm thing, is the new stadium for San Diego State. So this would not exist. The new stadium in San Diego for San Diego State would not exist. Instead, Balboa Stadium at its current location right next to downtown would be expanded and retrofitted into a solid 35,000-seat stadium. San Diego State would play their games there in perpetuity, while UCSD would play their games in the new Qualcomm Stadium along with the Chargers. That stadium would be closer to La Jolla, would be a nice place to play for the upstart college football team. Next up, there's UC Irvine, which also never had a football stadium. But here's what I will say. This school, no slouch on their facilities. Like I mentioned, Irvine's Great Park currently seats 5,000 people for the USL Championship soccer team, Orange County SC. Considering the amount of money in Irvine and the tons of space in the area, UCI could definitely build its own stadium and play in it. Or if it decided to not use its space, there's always the option of theoretically using Anaheim Stadium, which could seat 69,000 during its time as a football stadium for the LA Rams back in the 1980s. Cal State Fullerton actually played there back a couple seasons before Titan Stadium was built on campus. Fullerton would use Titan Stadium, but they need to add some seating in the end zones and above the embankments. If they do that, they will be set. Pretty nice stadium there. UCI could also look at expanding Santa Ana Stadium in downtown Santa Ana. That seats 9,000 fans, but it'd be a little bit of a drive from Irvine, and it's not exactly near campus. But either way, those are the current options. Again, this is currently, not when the school was first brought to life. I think, if anything, an on-campus or near-campus site would have to be chosen, and a stadium would have to be built. Or there's even a third option, converting LaBarge Stadium into their home stadium. That is currently used by OCC and some other Orange County teams. That was built back in 1955. That holds 7,600 fans. Just 5 miles from campus. Best option could be there. Moving up, UC Riverside played at Highlander Stadium over the years, which is where the team currently plays soccer, which isn't really a physical stadium or bowl or anything. There is Ted Runner Stadium, which was built on the campus of the University of Redlands. That stadium could house UCR if it was expanded, but it's obviously at Redlands. Now, Wheelock Stadium is where the Riverside City College Tigers play. That was built back in 1921. Now, hypothetically, the stadium could be expanded, but the better thing to do is have UCR's own on-campus stadium, which could draw tons of fans from the Inland Empire. Next, we'll move a little bit more north over to Cal Poly Pomona. Back in the day, CPP played football at Kellogg Field, which is now an on-campus small field used for soccer. There's plenty of space on campus for a field, but it would be the biggest building by far. So instead, we'll have them play over the stadium technically meant for San Antonio College or Mount Sac, New Hilmer Lodge Stadium. Now, the current stadium, which was built very recently, it suits 10,739 people. Pretty nice stadium, one of the nicer stadiums in junior college football. Now, if you add bleachers all around it, build it up a little bit, it'll stand around 25,000 people, be perfect for CPP and Mount Sac to use both. Now, moving more inland now, Cal State LA had been using the Rose Bowl, UCLA Stadium, when they were playing football. USC will still use the Coliseum. UCLA will still use the Rose Bowl. But I think Cal State LA will continue their tradition by using it for some weeks, as they did when they actually got 15,000 people for one game. But for all the time, for the rest of their games, they will play at Weingart Stadium on the campus of East Los Angeles College. That stadium was built back in 1951, holds currently over 22,000 people. Perfect size for their team. Maybe build it up a little bit. You could have at least 30,000 there. Now, back to UCLA for a moment. The idea of using the Rose Bowl, to me, it's always been ridiculous. It's so far from UCLA's campus and not even in their proper DeMolder recruiting area. So, what about an old-timey field? Gilmore Stadium. It's a stadium that was the former home back in the 1930s of the LA Bulldogs and Mustangs football teams back in the old times. That stadium could theoretically be used. By this point, it's more of an afterthought. If the Rose Bowl didn't have the history, then Gilmore Stadium would be a serious contender. All right, moving right along. The main LA school we're leaving out, Cal State Long Beach. Now, the first choice in my mind is the in-town Veterans Memorial Stadium, which was built back in 1950, holds 11,600 people. Again, hypothetically, it could be the spot to play football if it was built up just a little bit more. But there's also the option of playing at the original Home Depot StubHub Center, Dignity Health Sports Park, whatever you want to call it. That would be cool. Perhaps a move during real time since it's just 15 minutes away from the campus of Long Beach State. But hypothetically, could be a stadium on campus at Cal State Long Beach, but it's just not practical really when city-owned stadiums already exist. So, choice between those two, I think you got to go with Veterans Stadium. Build it up a little bit, keep it within the city. Moving up north now, Cal State Northridge had its own stadium at Devonshire Downs, which turned into a horse racing track in its later years, then was demolished. That field could have been expanded tenfold. I say you keep the land, build an even bigger stadium on that plot of land, you got yourself a stadium. Meanwhile, the most surprising of the big stadiums has to be UC Santa Barbara's Harder Stadium, which was built in 1966 has a capacity of 17,000. Back in its heyday, it actually get around 5,000 people in the crowd. But when UCSB started playing football back in 1957, they played at La Playa Stadium, the home of Santa Barbara City College. The only thing about that stadium, double-edged sword, is that the field literally right next to the beach with a view of the ocean and a 10,000 people capacity. It stays as a JUCO field. and one of the best at that. Instead, Harder Stadium is expanded to be FBS compliant. All right, along the 101, we hit Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where there was already a beautiful stadium, Alex G. Spano Stadium, which was built in 1935 under the name of Mustang Stadium, then remodeled. Initially, it was just 9,000. Now, with a little over 11,000, so that stadium already has legs. You got to expand it, make it 22,000. For the next schools, we're mainly going to skip them because they already have fields that they use. Fresno State has Bulldog Stadium, which replaced Ratcliffe Stadium on the campus of Fresno City College. They're set. San Jose Stadium, definitely set with Cefco Stadium, which has existed for ages. Stanford Stadium, Cal Memorial, all solid. And then UC Davis and Sac State, they both have on-campus stadiums. However, I like the idea of using different stadiums. So, Pacific used to have a great football team before the school cut it. Their stadium, Stagg Memorial, was one of the biggest in all of their division. I mean, look at it. Beautiful, but it fell into deep disrepair. I would have loved the Aggies to have used this stadium, even if it's over an hour away. I mean, it's still so crazy how the Pacific Tigers team, one that pulled in over 17,000 in attendance at one point, could just vanish just like that. Either way, let's start with Sac State. They first played at Charles C. Hughes Stadium in Sacramento, which still exists to this day, still holds 20,000 people. They could have stayed there, but they instead moved to Hornet Stadium on campus, seats over just 21,000. I think, for purposes like this, we keep Hornet Stadium expanded a little bit. Meanwhile, UC Davis has Toomey Field on campus, which held over 10,000, and now is UC Davis Health System Stadium, which holds just over 10,000. And I think it could be a great field for sure. Keep it there. Now, final school we have to get to is San Francisco State. Their stadium on campus has been there forever. Cox Stadium currently holds 4,000 fans, so not a ton. And there's also not a lot of information on it either, but as much as that on-campus stadium could work, I believe there's a much better option. That is Kezar Stadium. And apologies if I mispronounce that, Kezar, whatever you want to call it, in San Francisco. That held nearly 60,000 people at one time. It was in the perfect San Francisco location. Although the field has transitioned in later years, I believe it should have stayed in its original form and could have been changed to act more like a college stadium towards the end of the century. So that is where San Francisco State will play. So there you have it, folks. Every school with a stadium. So before we start the actual season, let's take a look at this 2020 hypothetical. There's the Pac-16, and then there's the newly formed, by me, conference called the Sunset Athletic Conference. Now, the original Pac-12 conference includes the original Pac-12. Utah, Colorado, UCLA, USC, ASU, Arizona, Washington, Washington State, Oregon, Oregon State, Stanford, Cal. But under the new Pac-16, we take out Utah and Colorado, schools that really, honestly, they belong in the Mountain West. We take out should-be Pac-12 schools, San Diego State, San Jose State, and Fresno State, and add them to the Pac-12. We also add 3 FCS schools from the Big Sky Conference, Sacramento State, UC Davis, and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. We then divide the conference into 2 sections, like it is right now. Pac-12 North, Pac-12 South, which places an emphasis on traditional rivals and location. Washington and Oregon schools stick with Stanford and Cal. Crosstown rivals UC Davis and Sac State are in the north. Then in the south, Arizona schools USC, UCLA, and the rest of the state schools, San Diego State, Fresno State, Cal Poly SLO, San Jose State. Now, we included these schools for a multitude of reasons, but mainly comes down to their history with football excellence in the FBS and FCS level. San Diego State, as of late, 10-win seasons almost every year. UC Davis was the cream of the crop for D2 for ages. San Jose State, Fresno State, they produce some talent here or there in the NFL, and they've always been competitive. Now for the other conference, it's 10 teams. In the name, the Sunset Athletic Football Conference. Now this conference is essentially what the CCAA previously was, but it includes some new teams that were in other conferences before that. Some might see this conference as the reject conference in comparison to the Pac-16, but I beg to differ. Some of these teams have top-ranked potential, especially if they're able to take down some of these other schools and be the top team in the conference. They could see themselves ranked in the top 25, much like Appalachian State or even UCF. So the Sunset Athletic Conference, Fullerton, Northridge, Long Beach, LA, Los Angeles, UC Riverside, UCI, UC Santa Barbara, UC San Diego, Cal Poly Pomona, and San Francisco State. After that, there will be no defecting of schools to other conferences, no cancellation of programs due to money. The only thing that will remain intact from present day will be when the schools are created and when they create football. So, in 1970, here's how the Sunset Conference would look like. You got the Ocean Division, Cal State Northridge, Cal State LA, UC Santa Barbara, San Francisco State. And then the Beach Division, UC San Diego, UC Irvine, Cal Poly Pomona, UC Riverside, Cal State Long Beach, Cal State Fullerton. Obviously, what type of monster would I be if I had Long Beach in the Ocean Division and not the Beach Division? Come on. Either way, similarly, a lot of the major conferences with 10-plus teams, there's a winner for the best of each division, and they will play for the Sunset Conference Championship. So the best of the beach, the best of the ocean will play for the title. Now, to those who say that the Pac-16 is a little bit too big, well, there are currently 4 major conferences that have 14 teams for football. So this is right in line with that. Meanwhile, the Sunset would have 13, which a bit much for a startup conference, but remember, this is a conference of teams that started out in the 1920s, so major advantage over other conferences that don't have as much history. Also, I understand that this conference is a little bit wonky in the fact that the entire conference is literally just California teams. But as we've seen with not just the CCAA, but also the NCAC, it doesn't matter if it's teams from just one state. Understandably, though, it's a little bit weird. States like Texas, Florida, Alabama, and North Carolina have teams in all different conferences. But this came out of most of those schools being either private or established later than conferences they could have joined. Now, this would be revolutionary for Division I FBS football, but not in the grand scheme of college sports or even college football. This happens all the time, and the Sunset is going to set the standard. All right, so here's how the point system works. Offense, you get 40. Defense, you get 40. Special teams, you get 20. You rate it out of 100. We're making it simple. So you get 10 points if you have the most pass and receiving touchdowns. You get 10 points for rushing touchdowns. 10 points for starting offensive line games. Pass and receiving yards, 5. Rushing yards, 5. Defense, tackles is 10. Tackles for loss is 10. Passes defended plus interceptions, 10. Sacks and QB hits plus forced fumbles, 10. Then for special teams, the field goal and PAT percentage is 10. Punt average, 5. Inside the 20. Amount of punts inside the 20 is 5 as well. And finally, when I went through the list of all these players, every player has different stats for different schools, etc. So, what I did in the stat system when I used the spreadsheet, if you played for an FBS school, I took your stats just as is, just times it by 1, right? If you played for an FCS school, I did it times 0.75 or 3/4, because, getting a tackle on an FCS running back is not nearly as impressive as an FBS running back. And to go through all the teams in the FCS, if you got a tackle versus Alabama, that means more than a tackle versus, Liberty. It's a little bit different. And it's also, I will admit that, but it's just impossible to rank, all the teams. So I just did, if you went to the FBS, you do it by 1. Now, JUCO and D2 stats, you do it by 0.5, so half. And I feel like that's pretty accurate. If you have, 1,000 rushing yards in JUCO, you probably get around maybe 500 if you went to the FBS. And then high school, I did this occasionally, but mainly 0.25, 1/4, because, there's no way if you're going for 30 touchdowns in high school that you're going to go for 30 touchdowns in college. It doesn't work like that. All right, so anyways, all these stats, the season is out of 10 games. So this is a per-game basis. All these stats for all these players, it's on a per-game basis. So the stats based out of 11 players. That means if a team wants different formations to better suit their needs, they can have 2 running backs, but they can only have 3 wide receivers and so on. So when I made these teams, it's all out of 11. And you can't have an extra receiver or anything like that. You just got to use one set thing. And this is all based on team needs. And the same thing for the defense. If they have a better linebacking core, then they go with a 3-4. Better D-line, a 4-3, or even maybe a 1-4-6 with 6 defensive backs. Either way, whatever floats the team's boat. And then, in making this whole point system, if there was a tie, if both teams had the same amount of points. I used a random number generator, and the home team, if they get a bigger number. So like, if the home team is numbers 1 through 7, the away team is numbers 8 through 10. So home field advantage is important here. I select a random number. If the number is 6, then the home team wins. But if the number is like 9, then the away team wins. So that's how, but the home team has a better chance of getting a number because they have more numbers to choose from. All right, so with that, let's run the simulation. All right, let's first take a look at the season for the Sunset Conference. Going through the schedule, Week 1 starts out with a huge romp. UC Santa Barbara with the 56-14 win over Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Matt Corral goes off for 300 yards and a couple scores. Week 2, 2 nail-biters. Both Cal State Long Beach and UCSD and the San Francisco State Cal State Northridge games go into overtime, and both home teams, thanks to that home field advantage, win in the end. Throughout the season, the clear number 1 and number 2 teams in the conference, UC Santa Barbara, UC Riverside. Riverside, get this is how many points they scored. 49, 49, 56, 38, 45, 49, 49, 56, 38, 42. 47.1 points per game en route to an undefeated 10-0 season. Huge seasons from running backs Demetric Felton and Travis Dye, the 1-2 combo, deadly on the ground, but also Hank Bachmeier was lethal through the air with his main guy, Khalil Shakir, catching bombs. But the other team that was forced to be reckoned with, UCSB. It's just an insane amount of talent offensively. Although their offensive line was a little bit susceptible at times, Toa Tawa, Matt Corral, and then the receiving combo of Drake London, first-round pick, and Zane Pope, too good, folks, not to mention having Kayvon Thibodeau and Noah Williams in the secondary makes up for a very strong defense. Your 2020 champion, though, none other than UC Santa Barbara, folks, the Gauchos. Corral with a clutch performance in the championship game, throwing for 250 yards, but rushing for 150, Sunset Conference record. Writing down the results of the schedule right here. Here's how teams fared. Cal State Fullerton, 8-2. San Francisco State, 7-3. Cal State Northridge, 6-4. All bowl game eligible, but there were some bad teams. Nobody worse than Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Although Richard Newton, top flight talent, collection of Cameron Pleasant, Devin Williams, Elijah Cooks, Benjamin Urosek, all capable receivers, their offensive line just had one solid starter in Colby Purcell, which meant a lot of sacks allowed on the year. Plus, their defense, aside from Jordan Perriman, Michael Wright, and maybe Robert Brown, didn't really have much going for it, especially in terms of stopping the run. One of the other worst teams, UC San Diego, my hometown Tritons. Pay me to watch them be that bad, but their offense was pretty dynamite. Braxton Burmeister and Chris Olave, Chris Brown Jr., Ben Ratzlaff, and Kyle Phillips. Their lack of offensive linemen was apparent, and the defense wasn't anything special in comparison to other teams. There are some stars for sure, Troy Warner, Asa Turner, Cameron Thomas, but aside from them, the linebacking core pretty weak, and there aren't any pure cover corners in the secondary. Cal State LA and Cal State Long Beach, pretty similar records, but different problems. The Diablos have a two-headed running back tandem, Chance Bell, Damian Moore, perhaps from one of the best tight ends on the West Coast in Greg Dulcich. Not a huge receiving threat, even with a good quarterback in Tavaka Tuioti. Their offensive line is just okay. On defense, aside from the five-star Justin Flo from Upland, Zoran Manley, and Clark Phillips III in the secondary, the D is just not anything to write home about, especially that defensive line. The 49ers, Long Beach State, is a team basically made up of St. John Bosco and Long Beach Poly kids, but there's spot talent in places. Obviously, with a guy like DJ Wangalele, you're going to have a super talented quarterback. But he didn't have the outright numbers this past season. Having a really good quarterback who can produce is essential in this conference. Meanwhile, his running backs, George Holani and Sean McGrew, bona fide studs. Plus, Jake Bailey, El Paso's own Justin Garrett, and San Jose State tight end Derek Deese Jr., all extremely talented, but the depth just was not there on the offensive side. Matt Smith, Aaron Frost, and Liam Jimmons, all good offensive linemen, but again, it comes down to defense. Chris Steele, Trent McDuffie, Tariq LaBeouf, all studs, but that front six, not as good as it needs to be. Cal State Northridge, another interesting team because the potential is definitely there. The receiving core of Michael Wilson, Jarin Pierce, Jermaine Burton, plus the running backs in Bobby Cole III, Andrew Van Buren, but also in the wings, running back receiver combo Isaiah Gable, Nazar Bombada, plus Jordan Palmer, the number 2 offensive center in the country. A couple of All-American defensive backs, Outland nominee Donovan West, defensively Diamond Harrell, Brendan Radley Hines, and JUCO stud Anthony Lira. Watch out. CSUN, definitely some ballers. Now, Cal Poly Pomona, they've got the Heisman favorite in C.J. Stroud, but their receiving core wasn't really the best, plus their offensive line not as experienced as it should be. The depth defensively, aside from Corey Bethley, Nick Figueroa, and Logan Graham, not a ton of stars on that team. Now, with the Sunset Conference done, these results very interesting, and it all goes to show you how important California recruits are for teams outside of California, at least for some schools. Now, the top team without a doubt, the Fresno State Bulldogs. Fresno State, a perfect 10-0. The Bulldogs averaging 56 points per game. Insane. 56, 56, 60, 70, 56, 45, 45, 56, 56, and 60 points. Unbelievable. The next 2 teams, Washington State and Arizona State, both at 9-1. Then all 3 teams in USC, UCLA, San Diego State at 7-3. Now, the South was clearly the better of the 2 divisions. Sac State Hornets, Oregon State Beavers, the first winless 0-10, and then 1-9 for the Beavers. The champion, a bit of an upset. Washington State over Fresno State to go to the Rose Bowl. Pretty close game, but in the end, Washington State's offensive prowess was all they needed. But Fresno State was no slouch either. Check out their roster. You have the Nebraska starter, Adrian Martinez under center, dual threat, beast of a quarterback. 2 insane running backs, Chuck Williams from UNLV, Ulonzo Gilliam, then 3 receivers, Jalen Cropper, Josh Kelly, Jalen McMillan. Solid offensive line, but an even better front 7 on defense. David Perales, Aaron Mosby, Justin Rice, Marcus Hawkins, and Cam Lockridge of Hawaii fame. It's really a complete team. Meanwhile, USC, UCLA, and San Diego State, all very successful. SDSU, unlike their other San Diego counterparts, a very solid and complete roster. The Aztecs, despite not having a great offensive line, have one of the best rushing attacks in the conference. Greg Bell, C.J. Verdell, and Keenan Christian, plus Carson Baker from Helix, throwing passes to Quentin Harrison and Jesse Matthews. But the key for San Diego State, a fantastic defense with a whole host of kids, mainly from Helix High. Jahad Woods, Scotty Young, but also one of the most productive players ever, Devin Lloyd, and even Quentin Frazier. The defense, really the backbone of the squad. Meanwhile, the 2 LA schools really suffered in terms of their lines. The offensive line and defensive line both struggled, at least for USC. Their skill spots, like we mentioned, just so good. For USC, Jamar Jefferson from Narbonne, a 1,000-yard rusher. Doug Broomfield, dual threat. Jake Garcia, big-time arm. Romeo Dubs, underrated deep threat. Linebackers, pretty solid. Darian Butler, Lawson Hall, and then the secondary featured Wyland Free, Gary McGuire, and Marshawn Cameron. Just a solid group in the secondary. UCLA, similar structure. Jalen Daniels throwing the football, Armani Rogers as a dual threat. B.J. Perkinson, decent stat line, but Kyle Williams, Bryson Tremaine, and Robbie Farrell is where their strength lies offensively. Defensively, their defensive line was actually a strength, ironically enough. Anthony Jones, Jonah Tavai, and Amir Crowder. Then in the secondary, Marte Mapu and Burdale Robbins, both really solid players back there. Meanwhile, the Cal Golden Bears, they have the pieces, but the overall depth isn't quite there, which is why they went 5-5 on the year. Jake Hayner plus Kyrie Robinson, Austin Jones at running back, a couple stud JUCO receivers in Mason Starling and Jeff Weimer, 2 solid offensive linemen in Dimitri Ali Ifua and Jalen McKenzie, but no other big names. On the line, Isaiah Foskey, linebacker Nate Landman, and defensive back Zamir Wallace were all awesome, but they were studs amidst a lot of non-studs. So the potential is definitely there, but you got to have every position filled with studs instead of just a couple. So some final notes about the Pac. While UC Davis was a little bit more successful, Sac State was just terrible. Their quarterback, a JUCO stud, Jake Dunaway, the first-team Big Sky receiver Pierre Williams, but aside from them, good but not great players, especially on the line as well. Aside from Nate Brown, just like Cal, they had Will Buck, a beast, Lavelle Bailey, beast linebacker, and then a really solid secondary, Trey Jenkins and Trey Wortham. But a team isn't necessarily made by its secondary when you can't stop the run or get pressure on the quarterback. So overall, we learned that having an all-star quarterback means everything, but having depth on defense might mean that much more. Wrapping up the season in college football, some bowl games and awards for the Pac and the Sunset Conference. The Pac Player of the Year, Adrian Martinez, Fresno State. The Offensive Player of the Year, Jamar Jefferson, USC. And the Defensive Player of the Year, Zion Tupola-Fetui from Washington. And then in the Sunset, Matt Corral from UCSB. Drake London, also from UCSB, gets the Offensive Player of the Year award. Then the Defensive Player of the Year, Cade Hall from San Jose State. Now, of the bowl-eligible teams from the Sunset, Cal State Northridge, UCSB, ranked number 23 in the nation. San Francisco State at 7-3, Cal State Fullerton at 8-2, and UC Riverside at 10-0, number 25th in the nation. Now from the Pac, Washington State 9-1, they were number 7, USC 7-3, UCLA 7-3, San Diego State at 7-3. Arizona State 9-1, they're 13th best in the nation, and Fresno State 10-0 at number 11 in the nation. Now the bowl games. The Rose Bowl, it's Washington State against Ohio State. The Peach Bowl, Fresno State against Pittsburgh. Citrus Bowl, UCSB against Michigan State. The Alamo Bowl, Arizona State against Oklahoma. Las Vegas Bowl, UC Riverside against Kentucky. Music City Bowl, USC and Purdue. The Sun Bowl, UCLA and Central Michigan. The Outback Bowl, Cal State Fullerton against Arkansas. The Boca Raton Bowl, San Francisco State against Appalachian State. And the Bahamas Bowl, Cal State Northridge against Toledo. All right, so now we simmed the bowl games, and here's what happened. The Sunset not really as good as the Pac, but UC Santa Barbara and UCR both pull out wins over Kentucky and Michigan State. Cal State Fullerton loses to Arkansas. CSUN loses to Toledo. But San Francisco State, a little bit of an upset over Appalachian State. Meanwhile, because Washington State upset the previously undefeated Fresno State Bulldogs, the Dogs get to play in the Peach Bowl against Pittsburgh, while Washington State goes to the Rose Bowl and wins against Ohio State. A lot of dynamics at play here because a ton of players coming from Ohio State, like C.J. Stroud, now plays for Cal Poly Pomona, but too many things to take into account to make it realistic. You gotta take it at face value, folks. All right, so you've reached the final episode, final part of the Great California Football Experiment. So the biggest question you're asking yourselves is, what does this all mean? Does this mean anything? I mean, obviously, this is what you take it as. This isn't going to be the reality. I know that. You know that. You're only watching or listening because this is fun and learning about California college football is fun. But for real, I mean, if this ever catches fire, I would hope that people pay attention because the one thing that's going to be and will always be is there's always going to be talented players in California. I mean, this is the biggest state in the nation. It's also one of the biggest economies, one of the biggest places in the world, really. And it's always going to produce football talent. I hope this brings to light just how much talent there is, and I hope it brings up a conversation about schools bringing back football. And this is not an attack on Title IX. This is not meant to be a Title IX issue. Women's sports are important. They're gaining traction, and they should still exist. My thing is, in California, if you build it, will they come? and that's been the biggest question over time, is what's going to happen, in the future. Should we bring back football? Is sports going to become a thing again in California? Do people even care? I think it's an interesting thing to think about of like, what would happen if football still existed at some of these schools and if they were playing in the D1 level. Football still exists at the D3 level and some of these other colleges. But especially considering how good some of the JUCO schools are, like if you shut down some of these JUCO schools and, put all the money and resources into a D1 program at, Long Beach or wherever, I think you could have a legitimate thing there. I really do. I really think it could be something cool. And especially with NIL deals these days. I don't know. I just think there's a lot of money and potential, especially in California. The state's getting bigger. There's a lot of people coming. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting idea. Will it happen? Probably not. But I just hope it gets the ball rolling that, in this alternate universe, that college football could have been absolutely enormous in California. But fortunately, that's not where we live. So hopefully you enjoyed listening to me for a couple hours talk about football. Thanks so much for watching. Leave a comment below, whatever you think. Thanks so much. Take it easy.